My name is Hannah Walker. 6 days ago, I walked away from a place I never imagined I would leave with a broken heart. It was my father's retirement party. For 6 months, I worked day and night to make that event perfect. I answered phone calls in the middle of the night. I handled problems no one else wanted to deal with. I pushed my own life aside because I wanted everything to go smoothly. I wanted my father to be happy, and deep down, I think I wanted something else too. Just once, I wanted him to look at me and say, "Hannah, I'm proud of you." But I wasn't prepared for what happened that night. Standing in a room filled with hundreds of people, I realized that the people I had spent my entire life putting first didn't see me the way I saw them. The most painful part wasn't something a stranger said. The most painful part was how my own family treated me. That night, I quietly walked out of the party. Nobody stopped me. Nobody followed me. Nobody asked if I was okay. Then 6 days passed. Not one phone call. Not one text message. Nothing. And then, this morning, my phone rang. My mother's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for a long time, because after what happened 6 days ago, I never expected to hear from her again. Eventually, I answered, and what I heard on the other end of that call changed everything. If you enjoy family drama, family betrayal, and emotional real-life style stories, subscribe to HeirNova and stay with me, because what happened after that phone call is something my family never forgot. For most of my life, I thought being the responsible daughter was a good thing. I thought it meant my family trusted me. I thought it meant they appreciated me. What I didn't realize was that trust and appreciation aren't always the same thing. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, with my parents, Michael and Patricia Walker, and my younger sister, Ashley. From the outside, we looked like a normal family. Dad owned a manufacturing company he'd spent years building. Mom handled everything at home. Ashley was outgoing, funny, and seemed to make friends everywhere she went. And then there was me. I was the dependable one. At least, that's what everyone called me. When Ashley forgot something, I helped her. When she got herself into trouble, I helped fix it. When my parents needed something done, they called me first. Back then, I honestly thought that meant I was important. One of my earliest memories is from when I was about 12 years old. Ashley had a school project due the next morning. She'd known about it for weeks. She still hadn't started it. The night before it was due, she burst into tears at the dinner table. My parents immediately jumped into problem-solving mode. Before I knew it, I was sitting at the kitchen table, helping her finish the project while she complained about being tired. We stayed up until almost midnight. The next day, she got an A. That evening, Mom hugged her and said, "I knew you could do it." Nobody mentioned that I'd done most of the work. At the time, it didn't seem like a big deal. But moments like that happened all the time. Little things, small disappointments, tiny reminders that the rules weren't always the same for both of us. Whenever Ashley made a mistake, there was always an excuse. Whenever I made a mistake, there was always a lesson. And whenever I pointed out that something felt unfair, I got the same response. "Be the bigger person, Hannah." My mother must have said that 1,000 times while I was growing up. "Your sister needs more support. Family comes first. Stop being so sensitive." Looking back, those weren't just phrases. They were expectations. And somehow, those expectations always landed on me. When I turned 16, Dad started bringing me into the company after school. At first, I answered phones and organized paperwork. Then I started helping with scheduling, then billing, then client accounts. The older I got, the more responsibility I took on. I didn't mind. Actually, I loved it. Working alongside my father made me feel like I mattered, like maybe one day I'd earn his respect. By the time I graduated college and joined the company full-time, I knew the business inside and out. I knew the employees. I knew the clients. I knew which machines broke down every winter and which customers always paid late. The company felt like part of my life. Ashley wasn't interested in any of it. She bounced between jobs. A few months here, a few months there. Every time something got difficult, she'd quit and move on to the next thing. My parents never seemed concerned. "She's still figuring things out," Mom would say. Meanwhile, I was working 60-hour weeks and spending most weekends at the office. The funny thing is, I didn't resent Ashley. Not then. I just kept telling myself that eventually things would balance out. Eventually my parents would see everything I was doing. Eventually they'd realize who had been standing beside them all those years. I really believed that. And maybe that's why what happened later hurt so much. Because right up until the very end, I never saw it coming. For a long time, I convinced myself that things would eventually change. That if I kept working hard, kept showing up, and kept putting my family first, they'd finally see me. The problem was that every year I waited, the expectations grew. And so did the sacrifices. About 3 years before Dad's retirement party, he suffered a minor heart attack. It wasn't life-threatening, but it scared all of us, especially me. One day he was running the company like he always had. The next, he was in a hospital bed, being told to slow down. The doctors wanted him to reduce stress and spend less time working. The company couldn't stop just because Dad was recovering, so someone had to step in. That someone was me. For months, I practically lived at the office. I was there before sunrise. I was there after everyone else went home. I handled meetings, dealt with clients, approved orders, solved employee issues, and made sure payroll went out on time. There were nights when I fell asleep on the couch in my office because driving home for a few hours didn't make sense. I wasn't looking for praise. I just wanted the business to survive. I wanted Dad to come back to something stable. And honestly, I thought that's what family was supposed to do. Meanwhile, Ashley showed up once in a while. She'd bring Dad coffee, take a few pictures with him, spend an hour visiting. Then she'd leave. Everyone talked about how supportive she was. Nobody seemed to notice who was actually keeping the company running. I remember one afternoon sitting in a conference room after a 12-hour day. I was exhausted. My head hurt. I hadn't eaten anything since breakfast. Dad looked at me and said, "Good work." That was it. 2 words. And somehow those 2 words kept me going for months. Looking back, that's probably a little sad, but when you've spent your whole life chasing approval, you learn to survive on very little. Eventually, Dad recovered and returned to work. Things settled down, at least on the surface. Then something strange started happening. Ashley suddenly became interested in the company. For years, she had wanted nothing to do with it. Now she was asking questions, attending meetings, showing up at the office. At first, I was happy. Honestly, I thought maybe she'd finally found something she cared about. Dad seemed thrilled. Mom couldn't stop talking about it. Ashley's finally finding her place. I heard that sentence so many times I lost count. What nobody seemed to realize was that Ashley didn't actually know how the business worked. After meetings, she'd come into my office and close the door. "What does this report mean? Why is this client upset? Can you explain these numbers to me?" I'd spend hours helping her, sometimes entire afternoons. I showed her how contracts worked. I explained client relationships. I walked her through budgeting, scheduling, and operations. Every question she had, I answered. Every problem she ran into, I helped solve. I thought we were becoming a team. I thought we were finally working together. What I didn't notice was that something else was happening. Every time Ashley learned something, she got credit for it. Every time I taught her something, nobody noticed. One afternoon, Dad asked Ashley to give a presentation to a major client. She panicked. She had no idea how to prepare. So after work, I stayed with her for nearly 4 hours. I built the presentation, organized the financial reports, prepared talking points, answered questions. By the time we finished, it was almost 10 at night. The next morning, the meeting went perfectly. That afternoon, Dad called Ashley into his office. About an hour later, she came out smiling. "What happened?" I asked. She laughed. "Dad said he's proud of me." I smiled back. "That's great." And I meant it. At least I thought I did. But that night, sitting alone in my office, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not because I wanted praise, not because I wanted attention, but because for the first time, I started wondering if anyone actually saw what I was doing. It was an uncomfortable thought. So I pushed it away. A few months later, Dad announced something huge. He was officially retiring. The company had been his entire life. Now he wanted to step back and enjoy retirement. Naturally, everyone started talking about the retirement party. It wasn't going to be a small family gathering. It was going to be a major event. Hundreds of guests, business partners, longtime clients, community leaders, former employees, people from all over the state, and almost immediately, everyone looked at me. Because whenever something important needed to happen, I was the person they counted on. I handled the venue, the catering, the invitations, the schedules, the guest list, the decorations, the vendors, everything. For 6 months, the retirement party became a second full-time job. Some days I worked at the company all day and spent half the night planning the event. I barely had time for anything else. But I wanted it to be perfect. Dad deserved that. At least, that's what I believed. As the event got closer, though, something started bothering me. Dad and Ashley were spending more time together. Private meetings, private conversations, closed office doors. Whenever I walked in, the subject changed. Whenever I asked questions, I got vague answers. "Don't worry about it. We'll tell you later. It's a surprise." At first, I didn't think much of it, but eventually, it became impossible to ignore. Then 1 week before the retirement party, something happened that left a knot in my stomach. Dad invited Ashley to a private dinner with several of the company's biggest clients. Not me, Ashley. That had never happened before. Not once. When I asked Mom about it, she didn't even look up from what she was doing. "Your father is helping your sister build relationships." I stared at her. What about the relationships I've spent years building? The second the words left my mouth, I knew I'd made a mistake. Mom's expression changed immediately. Hannah. That tone. The one I'd heard my entire life. The warning tone. The tone that always came right before I was told I was being selfish. "Not everything is about you." I didn't argue. I never did. But for the first time, something inside me felt different. For the first time, I wasn't sure they were right. And for the first time, I started wondering if maybe I had spent years earning a place in a family that had already decided exactly where I belonged. What I didn't know was that the retirement party was only a few days away, and the worst moment of my life was waiting for me on that stage. The night of my father's retirement party started before sunrise. By 6 o'clock that morning, I was already at the ballroom making sure everything was ready. The florist had delivered the wrong centerpieces. One of the speakers was running late. A problem with the sound system needed to be fixed. Just normal event day chaos. The kind of thing nobody notices when everything goes right. And somehow, I handled all of it. By the time guests started arriving that evening, I was exhausted. But I was proud. For 6 months, I had poured everything into that event. And looking around that ballroom, I felt like it had been worth it. Nearly 500 people showed up. The room was packed. Business partners, employees, family friends, former clients, people who had known my father for decades. Every table was full. People were laughing, sharing stories, and congratulating Dad. For the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely happy. I remember sitting there thinking, maybe tonight will be different. Maybe after all these years, Dad would finally acknowledge everything I'd done. Maybe I'd stop feeling invisible. I wasn't expecting a standing ovation. I wasn't expecting a speech about me. I just wanted to know that he saw me, that all those years had meant something. A little after 7, Dad walked onto the stage. The room immediately went quiet. He smiled as everyone applauded. Then he started speaking. At first, everything felt normal. He thanked employees. He thanked old friends. He thanked clients who had supported the company over the years. People laughed at his stories. A few got emotional. Then he started talking about the future of the company. And that's when something changed. Dad smiled and looked toward Ashley. I remember noticing it immediately, because the look on his face wasn't random. It felt intentional. He started talking about sacrifice, about commitment, about loyalty, about someone who had stepped up when the family needed them most. At first, I assumed he was talking about me. Honestly, who else could it have been? Then he said Ashley's name. The room exploded into applause. For a second, I thought I had misheard him. I actually sat there waiting for him to correct himself. But he didn't. Instead, he kept going. Every story he told belonged to me. The late nights, the difficult clients, the years of work, the sacrifices, the responsibility. All of it. Story after story, memory after memory, achievement after achievement. Every single one attached to Ashley. People kept clapping. People kept smiling. Some were looking at Ashley with admiration. Meanwhile, I felt completely frozen. I honestly don't know how to describe that feeling. It wasn't anger, not at first. It was confusion. Like my brain couldn't process what was happening. I kept thinking, surely someone else notices this? Surely somebody knows none of this is true? But nobody said anything. Nobody looked confused. Nobody questioned it. Ashley stood up and smiled as people applauded her. And somehow that hurt even more. Because she knew. She knew exactly who had done those things. She knew exactly whose life Dad was describing. And she stood there accepting credit for all of it. I looked around the room. Nobody seemed uncomfortable. Nobody seemed surprised. That was the moment something inside me started to crack. Because for the first time, I realized this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. Nobody had gotten confused. This was deliberate. When the speech finally ended, people rushed over to congratulate Ashley. I watched strangers shake her hand. I watched employees praise her leadership. I watched clients thank her for work she had never done. And nobody knew the truth. I sat there for several minutes without moving. Then I finally got up and walked over to my mother. I wasn't angry. I wasn't making a scene. I honestly thought there had to be some explanation, some misunderstanding. I leaned closer and quietly asked, "Mom, what's going on?" She barely looked at me. "What do you mean?" I lowered my voice. Dad just credited Ashley for things I've spent years doing. For a second, she didn't say anything. Then she sighed. The kind of sigh someone makes when they're annoyed. Not surprised, not concerned. Annoyed. Then she turned toward me and said, "For once, Hannah, stop making everything about yourself." I can still hear those words. Not because she yelled them. Because she didn't. She said them calmly. Like she genuinely believed I was the problem. Like I was ruining the evening by noticing what everyone else was pretending not to see. I just stared at her, waiting for her to realize how cruel that sounded. She never did. Instead, she looked past me and started talking to someone else. As if the conversation was over. As if I didn't matter. I stood there for another few seconds. Then I walked away. Nobody stopped me. Nobody asked if I was okay. Nobody followed me. I grabbed my coat, walked through the lobby, and stepped outside. The parking lot was almost empty. The cool evening air hit my face. And for the first time all night, I could breathe. I sat in my car and stared at the steering wheel. I don't know how long I stayed there. 10 minutes, maybe 30, maybe longer. At one point, my phone buzzed. For a second, I thought it might be Dad, or Mom, or Ashley. Someone, anyone. It wasn't. Not a single member of my family called. Not that night, not the next morning, not the day after that. Hours turned into days, then days turned into nearly a week, and the silence told me everything I needed to know. If they were worried, they would have called. If they cared, they would have called. If they even noticed I was gone, they would have called. But nobody did. By the 6th day, I started accepting something I had spent years refusing to see. Maybe I had never been part of the family the way I thought I was. Maybe I had simply been useful. And once they no longer needed me in the room, they didn't notice I was gone. Then, on the evening of the 6th day, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen, and my stomach immediately tightened. It was my mother, the same woman who hadn't spoken to me since the retirement party. The same woman who told me to stop making everything about myself. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Then I answered, and the second I heard her voice, I knew something was wrong. She was crying, really crying, not angry, not frustrated, terrified, and what she said next changed everything. The second I heard my mother's voice, I knew something was wrong. She was crying so hard that at first I couldn't even understand what she was saying. "Mom?" A few more seconds passed before she finally managed to speak. "Hannah, please don't hang up." For a moment, neither of us said anything. The truth is, a part of me was still angry. 6 days earlier, she had watched me get humiliated in front of hundreds of people. Then she acted like I was the problem, and now she was calling me in tears. I didn't know what to feel. "What happened?" I asked. The silence on the other end lasted long enough to make me nervous. Then she said something I never expected to hear. "We need your help." I closed my eyes. Of course. Even after everything, that's how the conversation started. Not an apology. Not, "How are you?" Not, "We were wrong." Just, "We need your help." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because somehow, it was exactly what I should have expected. "What happened?" I asked again. This time, her answer came quickly. "The company is falling apart." For a second, I thought I had heard her wrong. "The company?" "Yes." My mother's voice cracked. "Hannah, things are bad." I sat down slowly. My heart started beating faster. Because no matter how hurt I was, that company had been a huge part of my life for years. "What do you mean bad?" Another pause. Then the truth started coming out. 3 days after the retirement party, one of the company's biggest clients canceled a major contract. A contract worth millions. The client had been working with the company for almost 10 years. And suddenly, they were gone. At first, nobody understood why. Then a second client left. Then a third. Within days, panic spread through the office. Employees were scared, managers were confused, and Dad couldn't understand what was happening. Then Mom said something that made everything click. "The clients were calling you." I frowned. "What?" "They were calling you, Hannah." Suddenly everything made sense. Those weren't just company accounts. Those were relationships. Relationships I had spent years building. Clients didn't stay because of a logo. They stayed because they trusted people. And many of them trusted me. When I walked away after the retirement party, nobody bothered reaching out. Nobody explained anything. Nobody corrected the lies. From the client's perspective, I had simply disappeared. And apparently, they had questions. Questions nobody else could answer. Questions Ashley definitely couldn't answer. "What happened when they called?" I asked. Mom hesitated. Then she quietly said, "Ashley couldn't help them." I didn't respond, because I already knew what she meant. The stories Dad told at the retirement party weren't just embarrassing. They created expectations. People now believed Ashley had been running things. The problem was, she hadn't. Not even close. The truth was finally catching up to everyone. Mom kept talking, and somehow every new detail made the situation worse. Clients were frustrated. Projects were delayed. Employees were leaving. Problems that normally took me 10 minutes to solve were sitting unresolved for days. The company wasn't collapsing because Ashley was a bad person. It was collapsing because everyone had spent years pretending she was someone she wasn't. And now reality was showing up. The hardest part wasn't hearing any of that. The hardest part was realizing nobody had noticed how much work I actually did until I stopped doing it. For years I had been invisible. Now suddenly everyone could see the empty space. "Hannah," my mother's voice pulled me back. "We need you to come in." I looked out the window. The sun was starting to set. Cars moved slowly through the parking lot outside my apartment. For the first time in my life, I didn't immediately say yes. I just sat there, thinking. Because this wasn't another late-night emergency. This wasn't another problem I was responsible for fixing. This was a crisis, created by choices they made. Choices they defended. Choices they celebrated. And now they wanted me to clean up the mess. Again. "What about Ashley?" I finally asked. The silence that followed told me everything. Then Mom answered quietly, "She's overwhelmed." I almost laughed again. Overwhelmed. After a week, I had spent years carrying responsibilities nobody even acknowledged. Ashley carried them for a few days, and suddenly everyone understood how heavy they were. The irony wasn't lost on me. Then Mom said something I never expected. "Hannah, your father was wrong." I froze. Because in my entire life, I had never heard my mother say those words. Not once. She defended him through everything. Every decision. Every argument. Every excuse. But now her voice sounded different. Smaller. Tired. "He knows it too," she said. "He wants to talk to you." I stared at the phone. Part of me wanted to hang up. Part of me wanted an apology. Part of me wanted them to finally understand what they had done. But another part of me was terrified. Because for the first time, it sounded like my family was finally seeing the truth. And sometimes, the truth hurts more than the lie. Then Mom said one last thing. Something that stayed with me long after the call ended. "Hannah." I waited. And through tears she whispered, "I don't think we ever realized how much you were carrying until you put it down." The call ended a few minutes later. I sat there alone in my apartment. The room was completely silent. 6 days earlier, I thought I had lost my family. Now it sounded like they were finally starting to understand what they had done. The question was it too late? Because the next morning, I was about to walk back into that company for the first time since the retirement party. And what I found there would change everything I thought I knew about my family. The next morning, I parked across the street from the company and just sat there for a minute. The building looked exactly the same. Same parking lot, same front entrance, same sign out front, but it didn't feel the same. For the first time in years, I wasn't arriving early to solve someone else's problems. I wasn't rushing inside with a to-do list. I wasn't carrying the weight of the entire place on my shoulders. I was simply showing up to see the damage. And honestly, part of me wasn't sure I even wanted to walk through those doors. Eventually, I got out of the car. The moment I stepped inside, people noticed. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. A few employees looked relieved. Others looked uncomfortable. Several walked over to say hello, not because they wanted to be polite, because they looked genuinely happy to see me. That surprised me. I hadn't realized how much I needed that. After 6 days of silence from my family, it felt strange hearing people say, "We're glad you're back." I wasn't back. At least not yet. But I nodded anyway. Then I headed toward Dad's office. The door was already open. Dad looked older than he had 6 days earlier. A lot older. His shoulders were slumped. The confidence I was used to seeing wasn't there anymore. Ashley sat quietly in a chair beside the desk. Mom stood near the window. Nobody spoke at first. The room felt heavy. Finally, Dad stood up. "Hannah." I nodded. "Dad." Another silence. Then something happened that I honestly never expected. My father apologized. Not a half apology, not an excuse, not a justification. A real apology. I was wrong. Those 3 words hit harder than I expected, because I had spent years imagining what it would feel like to hear them. And now that they were finally here, they didn't magically fix anything. They just made me realize how much damage had already been done. Dad looked down at his desk. "I should have recognized everything you've done for this company." Nobody spoke. "I should have recognized everything you've done for this family." Still nobody spoke. Then he looked directly at me. "And I should never have let anyone take credit for it." For a moment, I didn't know what to say, because part of me had wanted this conversation for years, and another part of me was angry that it only happened after everything started falling apart. Ashley suddenly cleared her throat. When I looked at her, her eyes were red, like she'd been crying. "I owe you an apology too." I said nothing. She looked away before continuing. I knew Dad's speech wasn't true. The room became completely silent. I should have said something. There it was. The truth. The thing I had already known. But hearing her admit it out loud still hurt. Ashley wiped her eyes. "I kept telling myself I'd explain later." She laughed bitterly. But later never came. For the first time in years, she didn't sound like the favorite child. She sounded like someone who knew she had messed up, badly. Then Dad opened a folder sitting on his desk. Inside were financial reports, client reports, canceled contracts, project delays. A complete mess. The company was bleeding money. Not enough to destroy it. Not yet. But enough to scare everyone. Dad slid the papers across the desk. "I need your help." There it was again. The sentence I'd heard my entire life, but this time felt different. Not because the words had changed, because the people saying them had. For once, nobody was acting entitled. Nobody was pretending everything was fine. Nobody was demanding anything. They looked scared, and for the first time, they looked honest. I spent the next hour reviewing reports. The problems were serious, but they weren't impossible. The biggest issue wasn't money. It was trust. Several major clients felt misled after the retirement party. They believed the company had misrepresented who was actually handling their accounts. And honestly, they weren't wrong. One client had even written a letter explaining exactly why they left. I read it twice. The final sentence stayed with me. "We trusted Hannah Walker. We no longer know who we're dealing with." I slowly set the letter down. Nobody in the room said a word. Because there wasn't really anything to say. The truth was sitting right there on the paper. For years, I thought nobody noticed what I did. I was wrong. The people who mattered had noticed. The clients noticed. The employees noticed. The people who worked beside me every day noticed. The only people who hadn't noticed were the people I kept trying to impress. My family. And suddenly that realization changed everything. Because for the first time, I wasn't sitting there wondering whether I had value. I already had my answer. The evidence was all around me. The real question was whether I was willing to save a company that had allowed me to become invisible. Dad finally broke the silence. "Hannah, what do we do?" I looked around the room. At Dad. At Mom. At Ashley. Then at the stack of reports in front of me. For years, I would have answered immediately. For years, I would have sacrificed without hesitation. But this time was different. This time, I had conditions. And what I asked for next shocked every person in that room. Looking back, I think the hardest part wasn't being ignored. It wasn't watching someone else take credit for my work. And it wasn't even walking out of that retirement party alone. The hardest part was realizing that I had spent years trying to earn approval from people who had already decided what role I was supposed to play. For a long time, I believed my value came from what I could do for other people. How much I could help, how much I could sacrifice, how much I could carry. But eventually, I learned something important. The people who truly love you don't only notice you when you're useful, and they don't wait until you've walked away to appreciate what you brought to their lives. My family and I still have a relationship today, but it's not the same relationship we had before. Some things were repaired, some things weren't. The difference is that I no longer measure my worth by whether other people recognize it. I finally learned to recognize it myself. And honestly, that's something I should have done years ago. So let me ask you something. If you were sitting in that ballroom that night, and your family gave someone else credit for everything you had done, what would you have done? Would you have stayed, or would you have walked away? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoy family drama stories, family betrayal stories, emotional family stories, Reddit family drama, and realistic stories about complicated family relationships, don't forget to subscribe to HeirNova. Thank you for spending your time with me. I'll see you in the next story.